Professor Wilfred Lambert is said to have been the world's leading expert on cuneiform and a leading authority on Assyrian and Babylonian history. When I announced to him in April 2006 that the Assyrian chronology could be substantially reduced, he responded with scepticism. I might be able to reduce the early part of the Assyrian chronology, he told me, but the later part of the chronology is immovable. I had enough evidence then to show that he was wrong, but I still at that time had much work to do to produce a watertight case. Unfortunately, Professor Lambert died before I could complete my task, so I never got the opportunity to discuss my findings with him. I wish here to share with you the results of my investigations. Do not be put off by the fancy names I will be using, or the fact that the people of old used many alternative names. Just concentrate on the overall picture and the message which I am trying to convey. Hopefully the facts will speak for themselves. We assume that the Assyrian and Babylonian chroniclers who compiled the king lists and chronicles knew what they were talking about. We assume that their intentions were honourable. The truth of the matter is that they were none the wiser than we are today, and there is ample evidence to show that they were falsifying evidence in order to support a grossly inflated history, in order to demonstrate that their nation was the oldest. The Assyrian kings themselves actually warn us of some underhand practices which were taking place in their day. Esarhaddon, for example, wrote, "But he who blots out my written name by means of some clever device, destroys my memorial or changes its location, may Ishtar of Erech look upon him in anger, decree an evil destiny for him, blot out his name and seed in the land." Ashurbanipal likewise wrote, "Whoever destroys the memorial on which my name is inscribed, and the names of Esarhaddon my father, blots out those names through some clever trick." Note that the removal of names does not constitute trickery or clever device. It only becomes this if the perpetrator is changing the text, a practice which evidently was common both in Egypt and in Assyria. Tiglath-Pileser I makes it even clearer when he writes, "But whosoever shall break my memorial tablets and my prism, or shall deface them, or shall cast them into the water, or shall cover them with earth, or shall throw them like..." Here the words are too broken to be read, but it continues with, "into a pest house where they cannot be seen, or shall blot out my name which is written thereon, and shall inscribe his own name in place thereof, or shall devise any other evil scheme to do violence unto my memorial tablets." In other words, the practice of removing parts of texts and overwriting them at some later date was rife. Many of the monumental inscriptions which archaeologists have taken to be bona fide are actually the combined efforts of more than the one king, the later king or kings having appropriated the earlier texts to their own glory. This practice was also noted by the Swiss archaeologist Edouard Navel as occurring in the Egyptian monuments. Evidence of such erasures have been discovered in relation to one of Adad-nirari III's inscriptions and has been commented on by Stephanie Page, but she has assumed that they were done as an act of vindictiveness, an attempt to obliterate the name of Nergal Eresh, one of Adad-nirari's chief governors, from the monument. The stela was discovered in position inside the cellar of a late Assyrian shrine, set beside the podium, a placing that is unparalleled among the fine spots of other royal stelae. Albert Kirk Grayson, remarking on a tablet that contained Ashurbanipal I's long genealogy, wrote, "The script is Neo-Assyrian, which means that the inscription is certainly not contemporary." Von Soden has pointed out that there are several grammatical and orthographical peculiarities in the text which must stem from the Neo-Assyrian period. He concludes that the inscription is an ancient forgery composed to draw the king's attention to the restoration of some ancient structure. Borgia, however, thinks it is simply a poorly done late copy. Notice how hardly anyone wants to admit that they are dealing with a forgery. The suggestion that someone at a much later date would want to copy an old inscription raises the question why they would want to do so unless it was for the purpose of deception. It is extremely hard for an archaeologist to accept that their precious find, which has probably taken them years of painstaking digging to unearth, can be a forgery. In discussing the irregularities in the Tel al-Rima stele of Adad-nirari III, Chaim Tadmor came to the conclusion that a scribe had inserted an extra line sometime after the original text had been written. The question ought to be asked, why had this extra line been added at some later date? Grayson also noticed problems with texts belonging to Tukulti-Ninurta I. The reference to the deportation of a large group of Hittites in the king's accession year, which appears only here in inscription 16 and in inscription 17, raises problems, for both 16 and 17 are late texts, and this event is not mentioned in inscriptions from the earlier part of his reign. Part of one of Tukulti-Ninurta I's texts has a name which has been overwritten, showing that this particular text at least had been tampered with. The name Belit-Akkadi had been overwritten with Dinitu, we are told. Tiglath-Pileser I and Tukulti-Ninurta I supposedly conquered the same territories and supposedly built the same structures. The Ishtar temple at Ashur, for example, according to each king, was rebuilt on a different site in a different location. This is despite the fact that Ashurbal-Kala, the son of the later of these two kings, still referred to the selfsame structure as the Saqqara temple of Ariba-Adad, a king who supposedly preceded Tukulti-Ninurta I, the earlier of these two kings, by around 200 years. This means that the temple, which was supposedly knocked down by Tukulti-Ninurta I, as well as by Tiglath-Pileser I at a later date, should not have still been referred to as the Saqqara temple of Ariba-Adad. However, this chronological anomaly can be easily explained if we accept that Tiglath-Pileser I and Tukulti-Ninurta I were one and the same person. I would even argue that Tiglath-Pileser I alias Tukulti-Ninurta has appropriated the monuments of an even earlier king. It should be stressed that Tiglath-Pileser I is supposed to have lived around 150 years after Tukulti-Ninurta I, but between the time of these two kings there is what is known as a Dark Age. As J.A. Brinkman aptly puts it, architectural remains which may belong to this time are usually minor repairs on older structures, with no inscription left to record the identity of the repairer. In fact, no buildings have yet been excavated in Babylonia which can be dated with certainty to the time of any ruler between 1046 and 722 BC. The archaeological evidence, however, does not support such a gap. During this long period, there is absolutely no evidence of any technical advancement or changes to pottery styles or art. In fact, the only reason why this Dark Age is introduced is because of the Assyrian chronology. By demonstrating that Tukulti-Ninurta was another name for Tiglath-Pileser I, we immediately eliminate part of this Dark Age. So, effectively, we are looking at two main practices which affect our understanding of the Assyrian and Babylonian records. Firstly, that kings and queens of the ancient world had more than the one throne name. Secondly, they were appropriating the monuments of their predecessors and claiming for themselves the works of those former generations. Scholars seem to be completely oblivious to all of this. As I mentioned earlier, this practice of appropriating monuments was commented on by Edward Naville in relation to the Egyptian monuments. As the temples of the 12th dynasty had inscriptions only on the architraves and the doorposts, but not on the walls or the columns, it was easy for Amenephis III or Ramses II to use these flat and well-polished surfaces for celebrating his own glory, and thus attributing to himself the work of former generations. Regrettably, this warning by Naville has to date gone unheeded. Also, concerning what is known as Thutmose IV's Dream Stealer, the form and content of the document are strikingly unlike the official or royal records of the pharaohs. It is besides filled with errors and striking irregularities in orthography, and exhibits a number of suspicious peculiarities not to be expected in a monument of this class. It is therefore to be regarded as a late restoration, and it is a great question to what extent it reproduces the contents of a monument of which it is a restoration. Thutmose IV was an 18th dynasty Egyptian king. This stela was found in front of a famous sphinx and describes how the sphinx had been buried in sand and how the king restored the monument to its former glory. These irregularities in the text show that the stela is of a late date, and the suggestion that it is a restoration of an earlier monument is strained to say the least. At best, it was done by a late king who carried the same name as the 18th dynasty king. At worst, it is a forgery done to enhance the reputation of the Sphinx. Here is yet another example from the Egyptian records to demonstrate how the people of later times were deliberately reusing older texts to give themselves an air of authenticity. In Persian or Greek times, the priests of Khonsu at Thebes determined to record the story of the visit of King Hattusilis III to Ramses II to the greater glory of their god. They put the current tale into language as archaic as they could command and engraved it upon a stela, which is now our source for the document. In doing this, they evidently found some difficulty. The current version, of course, spoke of the king as Ramses or Ramses Meriamun. The priests, desiring to lend an official air to the stela, attempted to prefix to the king's name his full titulary, and in doing so used that of Thutmose IV. The truth of the matter is that the Assyrian and Babylonian scribes are guilty of doing exactly the same thing with their records. We tend to take it for granted that what we are told by the classical writers is accurate and reliable. A lot of writers, for example, tell us lots of wonderful things that Semiramis, the wife of Ninus, accomplished. For example, Diodorus informs us that Semiramis took for herself the construction of a bridge 5 stays long at the narrowest point of the river, skillfully sinking the piers, which stood 12 feet apart, into its bed. And the stones, which were set firmly together, she bonded with iron cramps, and the joints of the cramps she filled by pouring in lead. This bridge then, floored as it was with beams of cedar and cypress and with palm logs of exceptional size, and having a width of 30 feet, is considered to have been inferior in technical skill to none of the works of Semiramis. To put this last statement into simpler, more modern English, Diodorus is saying that the bridge was one of her greater achievements. But this is the selfsame bridge which Herodotus, who lived a few centuries before Diodorus, accredits to Nitocris, the mother of the Chaldean king Nabonidus. Nitocris also used the quarried stones to build a bridge, more or less in the centre of the city, and she joined the stones together with braces of iron and lead. During the day, squared-off planks of wood used to be laid on it, so that the Babylonians could walk across on them, but at night these planks would be removed so that people did not cross over and steal from one another. Some of the piers of this bridge were discovered by the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, who discovered an inscription of Nebuchadnezzar II on it, ascribing the construction of the bridge to his father Nabopolassar. The suggestion then that it was built by Semiramis around 2000 BCE, or even that it was built by Nitocris, the mother of the Chaldean king Nabonidus, are shown to be spurious. In fact, the information the Greeks provide concerning Ninus, the husband of Semiramis, shows that they are describing the exploits of Nebuchadnezzar II. At least Herodotus dated the works to the correct period of history, even though he attributed them to the wrong person. By contrast, the people Diodorus was relying on for his information were trying to convince him that the works were even older. The Egyptians even convinced Diodorus that the 19th dynasty king Ramesses II, who he called Ozymandias, lived long before the 12th dynasty. In part 2 of my video Manetho on Trial, I demonstrated that Herodotus was still alive during the time of Alexander the Great. Diodorus therefore lived around 300 years after Herodotus. As a general rule, the later the writer, the more corrupt the stories became. In his book Centuries of Darkness, Peter James commented that the ancient Greeks and Egyptians were competing in trying to prove whose race was the oldest, as this, he argues, highlights a factor frequently overlooked in modern studies of ancient historiography, the desire to claim and demonstrate a venerable antiquity. Archaeologists still to this day seem oblivious to this fact. As I shall proceed to demonstrate, the Assyrian and Babylonian king lists in which archaeologists are placing so much trust are contrived, being part of this move to demonstrate the great antiquity of the Assyrian and Babylonian history. Diodorus, and on each side of the river she, that is Semiramis, built an expensive quay of about the same width as the walls and 160 stades long. Herodotus. This, the altering of the course of the river, was quite a feat she, that is Nitocris, accomplished. Another one was to have an embankment built along both sides of the river. This is well worth seeing for its bulk and height. These quays, or embankments as Herodotus preferred to call them, were part of Nebuchadnezzar's works, which were started by his father Nabopolassar. Herodotus also tells us that Nitocris built a large lake to the north of the city. This will undoubtedly have been used to draw off water from the river to enable the aforesaid bridge and quays to be constructed. Diodorus describes a reservoir which he states was constructed by Semiramis. Nebuchadnezzar tells us that this reservoir, which he called Yapo Shapu, was built by his father Nabopolassar. This is an archaeological map of part of the city showing the location of this reservoir. Diodorus tells us, on both the towers and the walls of the palace there were again animals of every kind, ingeniously executed by the use of colours as well as by the realistic imitation of the several types. And the whole had been made to represent a hunt, complete in every detail, of all sorts of wild animals, and their size was more than 4 cubits. Among the animals, moreover, Semiramis had also been portrayed, on horseback and in the act of hurling a javelin at a leopard, and nearby was her husband Ninus in the act of thrusting his spear into a lion at close quarters. In this wall she also set triple gates, 2 of which were of bronze and were opened by a mechanical device. Koldewey identifies this palace with what he calls the Persian building. It was built by the Chaldean king Nebuchadnezzar II for his queen. Basically, the Greeks were being fed lies and deceptions, and they were transmitting them onto us, an unsuspecting audience. The later the writer, the more contrived the stories became. What we should be asking ourselves is, where did the Greeks get this false information? Surely they got a lot of it from the inhabitants of Assyria and Babylonia, the very same people who we are relying on for the accuracy of the Assyrian and Babylonian king lists and chronicles. If they were deliberately falsifying history, then we cannot put it past them to produce forgeries to substantiate their lies. Ashur-Adad I was the father of Ashur-uballit, who in turn was the father of Mubalitat-Shirua, his daughter. Dated some 200 years later, we have Ninurta-Apalai-Kor, who claimed to be a son of Ashur-Adad I. A fragmentary text from the city of Ashur records a gift of jewellery given by Ninurta-Apalai-Kor to his daughter, whose name is partially preserved as Mubalitat blank, his daughter, the great high priestess. David Wiseman has even suggested that this name be restored as Mubalitat-Shirua, but failed to make the obvious connection with Ashur-uballit's daughter. It is known that Ninurta-Apalai-Kor was a contemporary of the Babylonian king Melishipach, who claimed to be a son of Karigelzu II. It is known that Karigelzu II was a contemporary of Ashur-uballit. By demonstrating that Ashur-uballit was an alternative name for Ninurta-Apalai-Kor, we immediately start to reveal the contrived nature of the Assyrian chronology. It should be stressed, however, that Ashur-uballit and his family do not appear in the Assyrian and Babylonian king lists. He has been added to the list by scholars who have not realised that Ashur-uballit was an alternative name for Ninurta-Apalai-Kor. By adding him and his family twice, the Assyrian chronology has been artificially extended by around 200 years. Earlier on, we reduced the 300-year gap in the archaeological record by around 150 years by realising that Tukulti-Ninurta was an alternative name for Tiglath-Pileser I. By identifying Ashur-uballit as being an alternative name for Ninurta-Apalai-Kor, we have now closed that gap completely. The mysterious Dark Age no longer exists. This idea that kings had more than the one name is not one which archaeologists readily accept. John Oates, for example, wrote, "Ingenious though this idea is that Sin-Shar-Ishkun was another name for Ashur-etel-Ilani, there are a number of reasons for rejecting it. At no point in any of their Assyrian inscriptions is there any hint of such identity. Nor does any other Assyrian king use two different names in his official Assyrian inscriptions." This sentiment is also upheld by Grant Frame. There is no evidence that alternate throne names were ever used by Assyrian kings during their lifetimes. However, even as early as 1871, George Smith recorded that Balsham-Ishkun is the second name of another late Assyrian king, either Shalmaneser V or Sargon II, probably the latter, he wrote. He also noted that Esarhaddon had another name, and this is confirmed by the following inscriptions recorded by Lucanbill in his Ancient Records of Assyria and Babylonia. Sennacherib, king of the universe, king of Assyria, to Esarhaddon my son, who hereafter is named Ashur-etel-Mukun-Apla. Esarhaddon appears in yet another inscription as Ashur-etel-Ilani Mukin-Apli, king of the universe, king of Assyria, son of Sennacherib, king of the universe, king of Assyria, grandson of Sargon, king of the universe, king of Assyria. The truth of the matter is that kings of the ancient world had many names, and not just two. Hattusilis III, king of Hatti, was also known as Katassar. Muwatallis II, king of Hatti, was also known as Nergal. Urchi-Teshub, king of Hatti, was also variously known as Mersilis, Ulmi-Teshub and Lamash. A further name for Urkit-Tashub has recently been found at Hattusa in Anatolia, namely Kurunta, though archaeologists have not yet realised that this is a further alternative name for Urkit-Tashub and are trying to squeeze his reign into the time just before Hattusilis III took the throne. What I have given you so far is a brief demonstration of how the early Assyrian chronology can be reduced. For obvious reasons, I cannot cover all of the available evidence in this video. It can be shown, for example, that the Dark Age between the time of Shamshi-Adad I and Ashur-uballit, which supposedly lasted around 500 years, can likewise be eliminated. But let's keep things relatively simple. Now for the next stage, the late Assyrian period, which archaeologists insist is immovable. This is an Assyrian king list taken from Luganbill's Ancient Records of Assyria and Babylonia. Notice how column 3 ends with Marduk-Zakir-Shumi, king of Babylon, and column 4 begins with the selfsame king. We have assumed that they were two separate kings who ruled a few hundred years apart, hence have been called Marduk-Zakir-Shumi I and II respectively. We have also assumed that there are lines missing at the top of the monument, but I personally am not convinced. Looking at the photograph, I get the impression that there are no missing lines. It is argued that Marduk-Zakir-Shumi I was a contemporary of Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria. It can be shown that the records which have been ascribed to Shalmaneser III include appropriations by Shalmaneser V, who lived a couple of centuries later, and that some of the names and places recorded in those inscriptions make a reappearance during this later period. In other words, Marduk-Zakir-Shumi was king of Babylon during the time of Shalmaneser V, not Shalmaneser III. Notice how Nebu-Abel-Adina was an Uman, that is governor, both during the time of Ashur-nasir-pal and Sennacherib. Another coincidence perhaps? This is the Babylonian king list A. Notice how Nebu-Shuma-Ukin, who was a contemporary of Ashur-nasir-pal's father Tukulti-Ninurta, is recorded as being king of Babylon shortly before the time of Pul and Ulalea. It is generally acknowledged that Pul and Ulalea were Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V respectively, though I would challenge this and identify Pul and Ulalea as Bel-Ibni and Ashur-nadin-Shumi respectively. Either way, this places Nebu-Shuma-Ukin as a contemporary of Achaz, king of Judah, who was the father of Hezekiah. But it gets even more interesting. What I am about to demonstrate is that Ashur-nasir-pal II was the father of Shalmaneser V, not Shalmaneser III. I shall also reveal that Adad-nirari III was an alternative throne name for Ashur-nasir-pal II, who supposedly lived more than a century earlier. So bear with me as I go through the evidence to support this claim. This is what is known as the Babylonian Synchronistic Chronicle. Notice the occurrence of the names Shalmaneser, assumed to be Shalmaneser III, Nebu-Abel-Adina and Marduk-Zakir-Shumi. According to this chronicle, Shalmaneser was preceded by Adad-nirari, assumed to be Adad-nirari II, who was a contemporary of Nebu-Shuma-Ishkun, king of Babylon. It is accepted that this Nebu-Shuma-Ishkun is the person other writers have called Nebu-Shuma-Ukin. According to the Assyrian king list, Nebu-Shuma-Ukin was a king of Babylon during the time of Tukulti-Ninurta, who was the father of Ashur-nasir-pal II. As already stated, he is said to have been king of Babylon shortly before the time of Pul and Ulalea, who are understood to have been kings of Assyria during the time of Achaz and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Notice how there is no space in this chronicle for Tukulti-Ninurta and his son Ashurnasirpal II, who, according to the king list we have just been looking at, should appear here immediately before Shalmaneser. The chronicler is here placing the reign of Adad-Nirari immediately before that of Shalmaneser, which is where we would expect the name Ashurnasirpal to appear. Now pay particular attention to the cities said to have been conquered by Adad-Nirari. Only one Assyrian king claimed to have conquered these lands, and that was Ashurnasirpal, assumed to be Ashurnasirpal II. Tilba, Tilsha-Abtani and Tilsha-Zabtani of Ashurnasirpal's texts are the Til-Bit-Bari, Tilsha-Batani and Tilsha-Zabdani of the Babylonian Chronicle, which, apart from anything else, aptly demonstrates how the writing of names differed from scribe to scribe. But more importantly, the chronicle ascribes the conquest of these cities to Adad-Nirari rather than Ashurnasirpal. Here is a portrait of Ashurnasirpal II compared to a portrait of Adad-Nirari III. You have to admit that they bear quite a striking resemblance to each other. The evidence I am providing here is showing that this is the same king who used both throne names. Furthermore, when we compare the achievements of these two kings, we likewise find a remarkable correlation of events. Adad-Nirari III, for example, informs us that he marched to the Great Sea, that is the Mediterranean, and erected an image of himself in the city of Arvad, which is in the middle of the sea. He also received tribute from the kings of Tyre and Sidon. Ashurnasirpal II likewise received tribute from Tyre, Sidon and Arvad. Adad-Nirari III went up to the mountains of Lebanon and cut down cedar trees which he used for his palace and temples. Ashurnasirpal II likewise cut down cedar trees which he transported back to Assyria, where he built a temple to the gods Sin and Shamash. The evidence is therefore showing that Ashurnasirpal II and Adad-Nirari III were one and the same king. You should by now be getting some idea of how corrupt the Assyrian chronology actually is. Ashurnasirpal II and Adad-Nirari III both built the Nabu temple in Kalach. Nonetheless, Nabu's position was one of unusual prominence, and he enjoyed it as early as the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, who, as already noted, had erected a temple to him in Kalach, of which, however, no remains have been recovered. In contrast, the architectural remains of Adad-Nirari III's Nabu temple found at Kalach are impressively preserved. It is strange that we have no inscriptions belonging to Adad-Nirari III which mention the building of this Nabu temple. Ashurnasirpal records, "The former city of Kalach, which Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, a prince who preceded me, had built, that city had fallen into decay and lay in ruins. It was turned into a mound and a ruin heap." The only building works which can be ascribed to any king by the name of Shalmaneser at Kalach are those on Fort Shalmaneser, which was built by Shalmaneser III. But Ashurnasirpal II is regarded as the father of Shalmaneser III, and as such, Fort Shalmaneser would not even have existed in his day, let alone fallen into decay. Building works of Shalmaneser I and Shalmaneser II are searched for in vain. There is no evidence that any king earlier than Shalmaneser III constructed anything at Kalach. This means that Ashurnasirpal II lived and ruled long after Shalmaneser III. It should be stressed that no building works have been found at Kalach which can be ascribed to Ashurnasirpal II apart from his palace. By contrast, Adad-nirari III undertook extensive repairs to Kalach, yet there is not a single monument by Adad-nirari III to commemorate this work. At least that is what is assumed. Those monuments do indeed exist, but he has used its alternative name, that is Ashurnasirpal. What I have shown you so far defies the law of probabilities. How many coincidences do we need before we accept the obvious interpretation, that is that Adad-nirari was another name for Ashurnasirpal? The claim that there is no evidence to show that the Assyrian kings had more than the one throne name is therefore false. In fact, just like the Egyptian kings who I have shown in my video Manetho on Trial to have had many alternative names, the Assyrian kings likewise had multiple throne names. This is an archaeological map showing the city of Kalach. Adad-nirari III's palace is here. Ashurnasirpal's palace is here and may well have formed part of the same building structure. Shalmaneser III built the city of Kalach in the 13th year of his reign, which causes serious complications for the accepted chronological sequence. The suggestion that his father Ashurnasirpal built his palace before the city was built has been remarked upon by a number of scholars, but no one has been able to provide a satisfactory explanation for this enigma. Basically, you do not build a palace first and then afterwards, some 20 years afterwards to be more precise, build the city around it. Of course, this problem goes away if we accept that the palace belongs to the later Ashurnasirpal, who was also known as Adad-nirari, this later king being the father of Shalmaneser V. It looks like Adad-nirari III and Adad-nirari II may also have been one and the same person. The palace at the city of Apku was said to have been built by Adad-nirari II as he himself proclaimed. The ancient city Apku, which kings who preceded me had built, had become dilapidated and turned into ruined hills. I rebuilt that city, reconstructed it from top to bottom, completed it, decorated it in a splendid fashion, and made it bigger than before. I constructed therein my enormous lordly palace. Now Ashurnasirpal II also built his palace in Apku. I laid the foundation of a palace for my royal residence in the city of Apku with tablets of silver and gold, he informs us. Because of the appropriation of the monuments by later kings, however, we do not know which inscriptions belong to which king. We are in the difficult situation where we have to identify which parts of the text have been added to the original. Let's consider an example of this practice in respect of a monument where archaeologists are uncertain whether to attribute it to Ashurnasirpal I or to the later Ashurnasirpal II. The White Obelisk. Does it belong to Ashurnasirpal I or Ashurnasirpal II? This has been the subject of a protracted scholarly debate. Grayson, following Solberger's arguments, has identified the inscriptions as belonging to the same series as the other texts which have been ascribed to Ashurnasirpal II. In it, the unnamed king claims to have marched against the lands Harira and Chalchalush in the first year of his reign, being the eponym of Ashurnasirpal, which can be either Ashurnasirpal I or II. He goes on to mention lords who had fled to the land Shubru, which... This broken piece of text is completed for us in another of Ashurnasirpal's texts as, I brought back the enfeebled Assyrians who, because of hunger and famine, had gone up to other lands, to the land Shubru. In both texts, the king marched against the land which is in the region of Mount Kashiari, received tribute from Gilzanu in his first year of reign, and both make mention of a people who had fled to the land of Shubru. J. E. Reid informs us that we are left with one substantial piece of evidence in favour of Ashur-nasir-pal II. Both he and the White Obelisk King mention the Bit Nathi. It would be remarkable, as Solberger says, if our only two references to this building should happen to date from two different kings of the same name. Reid later rectifies this statement by adding that Shalmaneser II also mentioned the Bit Nathi. The problem is that the obelisk is of a similar style to that employed in the 13th century BCE. He informs us that Malouin's proposal that some sculptors, especially at Nineveh, were still working in an outdated style in the reign of Ashur-nasir-pal II is by its very nature irrefutable. Basically, this is evidence that the monuments of Ashur-nasir-pal I have been deliberately changed by the scribes at a later period. Ashur-nasir-pal I seems to have been the father of Shalmaneser III, whilst the later Ashur-nasir-pal, who we have called Ashur-nasir-pal II, who we have demonstrated was also known as Adad-nirari, was the father of both Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V. In one controversial inscription published by Daniel David Lukenbill, Tiglath-Pileser III even called himself son of Adad-nirari. Bear in mind that we have shown that Adad-nirari III and Ashur-nasir-pal II were one and the same person. It looks like Ashur-nirari, who has been called Ashur-nirari V, was an alternative name for Sennacherib, both kings having been murdered in the Heichal, a word which in both Assyrian and Hebrew can mean either a temple or a palace. We are told that the latter part of the Assyrian chronology, particularly from the time of Tiglath-Pileser III onwards, is immovable. Such is the conviction of archaeologists that they will argue that the biblical chronology is untrustworthy and that the Assyrian and Babylonian king lists and chronicles provide a firmer and more reliable foundation for the reconstruction of history. In making this claim, they are ignoring all of the contradictions and inconsistencies inherent in these chronicles and king lists. No one has even questioned the accuracy or reliability of these records or why they were compiled. Despite all the errors which have been noticed in these Assyrian and Babylonian records, such as the campaigns of Ashurbanipal being recorded in the wrong order in the Rassam cylinder, archaeologists are so blinkered in their acceptance of these records that they have completely abandoned the biblical chronology in favour of this alternative chronology, fully believing what we are being told, even to the extent of glossing over those blatant inconsistencies, which, had they been in the Bible, they would have happily torn to shreds. What we shall do here is what no one else seems prepared to do. We shall look at the Assyrian chronology from a biblical perspective. Bear with me on this, as although it might at first seem a pointless task, our investigations will eventually pay off. Be prepared, however, for some shock revelations. The Bible tells us that Sennacherib came up against Jerusalem in the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign. After his army was destroyed by the angel of the Lord, he returned to Assyria, where he was murdered, and his son Esarhaddon ascended the throne in his place. Esarhaddon's 12-year reign lasted from the 14th to the 26th year of Hezekiah. Working backwards, Sennacherib's 24-year reign must have begun in the 6th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, which means that he was co-ruling with Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V and Sargon II. Sargon II was the immediate successor to Shalmaneser V, though Sargon's inscriptions inform us that he was co-ruling with Shalmaneser V for 1 year before being invested on the throne of Assyria. His 17-year reign therefore started in the 5th or 6th year of Hezekiah, which means that his reign lasted until the 8th year of Esarhaddon. Sargon II was therefore co-ruling with Sennacherib and Esarhaddon after him. The scribes responsible for compiling the Babylonian king lists and chronicles would have us believe that Sennacherib ruled immediately after his father Sargon, and that Esarhaddon ruled immediately after Sennacherib, that there were no co-regencies. According to the Babylonian king lists and chronicles, Sargon II was king of Babylon for 5 years. It is interesting to note that he never once called himself king of Babylon, only viceroy of Babylon. As he himself declared, Sargon the great king, the mighty king, king of the universe, king of Assyria, viceroy of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of the 4 regions of the earth. A viceroy is someone who exercises authority on behalf of a sovereign. Esarhaddon likewise styled himself viceroy of Babylon. Esarhaddon, the great king, the mighty king, king of the universe, king of Assyria, viceroy of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad, king of Karduniash, that is Babylonia. Only one inscription records Esarhaddon as being king of Babylon, and this has been dated to the end of Esarhaddon's reign after Sargon had died. The evidence, when considered against the biblical chronology, therefore shows that Sargon and Esarhaddon were sharing the throne of Babylon. Sargon too started his reign halfway through that of his son Sennacherib. This would explain why Sennacherib does not name his father in his inscriptions, as he was not at that time a king. The suggestion that Sennacherib succeeded his father will shortly be shown to be false. According to the biblical chronology, Sennacherib was killed in the middle of Sargon II's reign. If this is the case, then it can be shown that the king lists and chronicles are highly contrived. Let us therefore proceed with our analysis. If we look at Sennacherib's annals, in his first campaign he placed Bel-Ibni on the throne of Babylon. The second campaign was against the Kassites, or more correctly Cushites, of Babylonia. His third campaign was purportedly against Tyre, Sidon, the lands of Judah, Hezekiah king of Judah, and the lands of Ammon, Moab and Edom. This despite the fact that the Babylonian chroniclers state that this campaign should have been directed against Babylon to depose Bel-Ibni. It should also be stressed that Sennacherib does not record any such campaign against Babylon in this year. As can be demonstrated, this third campaign, which was waged against the cities of Tyre and Sidon, and the lands of Judah, Ammon, Moab and Edom, supposedly all took place in the 1 year, 2 at the most. Note that this campaign, if it really happened when the annals say it happened, will have taken place around 7 years before Hezekiah became king. Sennacherib's fourth campaign was once more directed against Babylonia. It was in this campaign that he placed his son Ashur-nadin-shumi on the throne of Babylon. This took place in the 4th year of Sennacherib's reign, being 6 years before Hezekiah became king. The information just does not hold up to close scrutiny. Bel-Ibni, who was placed on the throne of Babylon in Sennacherib's first year, is described as son of a master builder, a scion of Shuanna, that is Babylon, who had grown up in my palace like a young hound. By following the biblical chronology as opposed to the one being followed by archaeologists, Bel-Ibni, which name can also be transliterated as Pul-Ibni, can here be identified as Pul king of Babylon of the Babylonian king lists, who is not to be confused with the earlier Pul king of Assyria who is mentioned in the Bible. The difference of the 3 years' reign attributed to Bel-Ibni and the 2 years attributed to Pul king of Babylon is down to the way the Babylonians calculated regnal years compared to the Assyrian method. It is a known fact that the Assyrians generally rounded up to the nearest year, whilst the Babylonians rounded down. Knowing this, it is not difficult to work out that Sennacherib's son Ashur-nadin-shumi was Ulaleah, king of Babylon. Again, the difference between the 6 years attributed to Ashur-nadin-shumi and the 5 years attributed to Ulaleah is down to the way the Assyrians and Babylonians calculated their regnal years. Note that these Babylonian kings were not kings of Assyria. They were kings of Babylon who had been placed on the Babylonian throne by the king of Assyria. It is important that we bear this subtle distinction in mind. According to Sennacherib, someone called Shuzubu usurped the Babylonian throne. Shuzubu is variously called Shuzubu son of Gachul, Nergal-ushashib son of Gachul, and Mushashib-Marduk. The name Shuzubu is sometimes written Shuzubi, as in the following text. In the course of my 4th campaign, I accomplished the overthrow of Shuzubi the Chaldean, who sat in the midst of the swamps. Like a criminal, he fled alone, and his place was seen no more. This same person is mentioned in Sennacherib's 6th campaign. This time Shuzubu did not escape. On my return march, Shuzubu the Babylonian, who during an uprising in the land had turned to himself the rule of Sumer and Akkad, I accomplished his defeat in a battle of the plain. I seized him alive with my own hands. I threw him into bonds and fetters of iron and brought him to Assyria. The king of Elam, who had gone over to his side and had aided him, I defeated. His forces I scattered, and I shattered his host. This, however, was purportedly not the complete story. In my 8th campaign, after Shuzubu had revolted, and the Babylonians, wicked devils, had closed the city gates, their hearts planning resistance, Shuzubu the Chaldean, a weakling hero who had no knees, a slave subject to the governor of the city of Lahiri, about him there gathered the fugitive Arameans, the runaway, the murderer, the robber. Into the marshes they descended and made rebellion. But I surrounded him completely. I pressed him to the life. Through fear and hunger he fled to Elam. When plotting and treachery were hatched against him there, he hastened from Elam and entered Shuanna, the sacred precinct of Babylon. The Babylonians placed him on the throne, for which he was not fitted, and entrusted to him the government of Sumer and Akkad. This passage actually incorporates the details of a number of campaigns in a form of a resume or flashback. The fleeing to the marshes by Shuzubu took place in Sennacherib's 4th campaign, after which Sennacherib placed his son Ashur-nadin-shumi on the throne. This means that it was Shuzubu who was responsible for deposing Bel-ibni, and not Sennacherib as claimed in the Babylonian chronicles. Shuzubu at that time escaped and fled to Elam. The second insurgents took place after Ashur-nadin-shumi's 5 to 6 year reign. According to this scenario, Sennacherib's 6th campaign must therefore have taken place in the 14th year of his reign, that is, at the end of Ashur-nadin-shumi's 5 to 6 year reign, and after Shuzubu's 4 to 5 year reign, Shuzubu by now being known as Ushashib-Marduk. This effectively means that Shuzubu reigned twice. As noticed by Albert Grayson, the names Nergal-ushashib and Mushashib-Marduk are both variations on the name Shuzubu. However, Grayson does not seem to have considered the consequences of this realization. This is what is referred to as the Babylonian king list. Notice first of all how Pul and Ulaleah appear 20 years before Bel-ibni and Ashur-nadin-shumi, despite them being alternative names for the same kings. The 1 year reign of Nergal-ushashib son of Gachul, who is called Shuzubu in Sennacherib's annals, has been placed after that of Ashur-nadin-shumi's, despite the fact that this 1-year reign actually occurred before Ashur-nadin-shumi was placed on the throne. Ushezib-Marduk, which is but a variant spelling of Mushezib-Marduk, is once again Nergal-Ushezib, also known as Shuzubu, who reclaimed the Babylonian throne after Ashur-nadin-shumi was deposed. As already stated, Grayson recognised that Ushezib-Marduk and Nergal-Ushezib are two variant spellings of the same name. The suggestion that Shuzubu started ruling for another 5 years immediately after ruling for 1 year simply does not make sense. Nor does it accord with what Sennacherib tells us. The evidence shows that this 1-year reign occurred immediately after Bel-Ibni and before Sennacherib's son Ashur-nadin-shumi was placed on the throne. It was at that time during Sennacherib's 4th campaign that Shuzubu fled to the marshes and subsequently fled to Elam. These are the first of many errors in the Babylonian king list. Also, the suggestion by the Babylonian Chronicle that Sennacherib deposed Bel-Ibni is clearly wrong. Bel-Ibni was actually deposed by Shuzubu, not Sennacherib. According to the Babylonian king list and chronicles, Sennacherib was king of Babylon for 2 years. In his monuments, Sennacherib never once claimed to have been king of Babylon. Notice how the synchronistic chronicle omits Bel-Ibni and substitutes the name Sennacherib in his place. In other words, Bel-Ibni's 2 to 3 year reign has been interpreted as belonging to Sennacherib. Remember that Sennacherib placed Bel-Ibni on the Babylonian throne in the 1st year of his reign, which effectively means that Bel-Ibni was acting under authority from Sennacherib. But the compilers of the Babylonian king list have added Sennacherib's 2-year reign in addition to that of Bel-Ibni's. Nabushum-Ishkun was a son of Marduk-apla-iddina, Marduk-apla-iddina being king of Babylon in the latter half of Sennacherib's reign, and who was defeated by Sennacherib in his 8th campaign. He is placed far too early in this list. Nabu-shuma-ukin was actually the son of Ukinza, and according to correspondence from Nippur, was co-ruling with his father when Tiglath-Pileser III conquered Babylonia. Yet again, a Babylonian king, this time Nabu-shuma-ukin, is misplaced in the king list, and yet we are accepting these king lists as being reliable. No one has bothered to question or challenge them, and yet everyone is keen to reject the biblical chronology in favour of these king lists, which are proving to be highly contrived. This is a rough outline of the revised chronology, taking these factors into consideration. Notice how Sennacherib's 1st year of reign probably coincided with the 7th of Tiglath-Pileser III. Even this is not certain, as the evidence suggests that there was probably a certain amount of co-regency between Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V. And the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul king of Assyria and the spirit of Tilgath-Pilneser king of Assyria, and he, that is Tilgath-Pilneser, a name which is usually written Tiglath-Pileser, carried them away. Even the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh, who dwelt to the east of the river Jordan, and brought them unto Chalach and Chabor and Hara, and to the river Gozan unto this day. This reconstruction shows that Ashurnasirpal II, also known as Adad-nirari III, also known as Pul king of Assyria, started the invasion of Israel, and his sons Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser V completed the task. It has been argued for some time that Tiglath-Pileser III was Pul and Shalmaneser V was Ulaleah. This is despite the fact that the Bible would have us believe that Tiglath-Pileser III and Pul were 2 different kings. This reconstruction shows that Tiglath-Pileser III could not possibly have been Pul. According to the king lists and chronicles, as well as what are known as the Limu lists, which we shall look at in a while, Tiglath-Pileser III became king of Babylon in the 15th year of his reign. This reconstruction shows that this was not possible, as this will have been when Sennacherib's son Ashur-nadin-shumi was king of Babylon. Tiglath-Pileser III himself announced, "Since the beginning of my rule I have brought under my sway, beginning with Dur-Karigelzu, Sippar of Shamash and Pasitu of Adunanu, and going as far as Nippur, the Itu and the Rubu tribes, all of the Arameans living on the banks of the Tigris and Surapi, as far as the Uknu by the shore of the lower sea." All of these places mentioned were in Babylonia. Tiglath-Pileser III was therefore king of Babylon and Babylonia from the first year of his reign. This has been recognized by J.A. Brinkman, but he has not challenged the accepted belief that Tiglath-Pileser III was the biblical Pul king of Assyria, or the fact that the Babylonian records only record him as being king at the end of his reign. Even the king lists do not mention him being king of Babylon more than once. Quoting J.A. Brinkman, accordingly, Tiglath-Pileser's first two campaigns, dating to his accession year 745 BCE and to his first year 744 BCE, were directed against Babylonia and Namri. In his campaign, which began in the month of Tashrit 745, this being around September or October time, Tiglath-Pileser did not come to subjugate Babylonia to the Assyrian yoke, and there is no record of hostilities with the Babylonian administration. Rather, he came chiefly to aid the Babylonian king, who was unable to keep order in his own land in repressing the Aramean and Chaldean tribesmen. The Assyrian campaign attacked many areas in northern, southern and eastern Babylonia. Notice how Brinkman assumes that Tiglath-Pileser III came chiefly to aid the Babylonian king. This assumption is not supported by Tiglath-Pileser's monuments. He assumes that the Babylonian king Nabonassar, a name which is sometimes written Nabonasir, must have been loyal to the Assyrian throne, an assumption which again is not borne out by the documentary evidence from this period. Notice how Brinkman is not prepared to challenge the accepted chronological framework. Instead, he tries to manipulate the data to fit the mainstream teachings. He continues by informing us that we have no explicit statement from either the Babylonian or the Assyrian side concerning Tiglath-Pileser's relations with Nabonassar. It seems that the Assyrian king did not visit Babylon itself at this time, nor did he attempt to depose the Babylonian king. Yet, if we can believe the official Assyrian accounts of his campaign of 745, Tiglath-Pileser must have travelled through much territory that nominally belonged to Nabonassar. Furthermore, the Assyrian king claimed to have become master of the land of Karduniash and of all the Arameans who lived along the Tigris and Surapi rivers as far south as the Uknu and the Persian Gulf. And shortly after his first campaign, he adopted the title King of Sumer and Akkad, implying some claim to suzerainty over Babylonia. He adds that Nippur, mentioned as terminus of one of his thrusts into Babylonia, continued under at least nominal Babylonian administration. He assumes this because correspondence dating to the time of Nebuchadnezzar, who is also known as Ukinzer, is assumed to date to the 15th year of Tiglath-Pileser's reign. And the reason why they are dated to the 15th year of his reign is because the Limu lists, which we shall look at in a moment, would have us believe that this is when Tiglath-Pileser defeated him. Take that misleading piece of information away from the equation, and we come to the inevitable conclusion that Nebuchadnezzar was defeated in the first year of Tiglath-Pileser's reign. My official I set over them as governor, Tiglath-Pileser III informs us after his first campaign. The fact that Tiglath-Pileser placed his own governor over the lands shows that Nabonassar could not have been in command of Babylon, as argued by Brinkman. This same statement that he set his official over them as governor is even repeated in the record of his defeat of Ukinzer, which suggests that we are talking about the self-same campaign. Basically, all the documentary evidence from Tiglath-Pileser himself points to him being king of Babylon and Babylonia from the beginning of his reign. When he conquered the lands of Babylonia, this conquest will undoubtedly have included the city of Sapi, which was Ukinzer's royal residence. The suggestion that Tiglath-Pileser repeated this campaign towards the end of his reign is neither supported by his monuments nor by the documented evidence from the archives at Nippur. Nor is Tiglath-Pileser III recorded in any of the king lists as being king of Babylon twice. The Limu lists, which would have us believe that this campaign occurred in the 15th year of the king's reign, are therefore shown to be wrong. In fact, these Limu lists, in which archaeologists are putting so much misplaced trust, are highly contrived. Tiglath-Pileser III relates his campaigns right up to the 17th year of his reign. There is absolutely no mention of a second campaign against Babylon or Babylonia after his conquest in his first year. The suggestion in the so-called Limu lists, also known as eponymy lists, that Tiglath-Pileser III conquered Ukinzer, king of Babylon, in the 15th year of his reign is therefore shown to be spurious, especially as it can be shown that Sennacherib's son Ashur-nadin-shumi was at that time king of Babylon. These Limu lists, which we shall discuss in a moment, are shown to be just as contrived as the Assyrian and Babylonian king lists and chronicles, in which archaeologists are placing so much trust. They completely ignore the co-regencies which we have demonstrated existed during this period. We are led to believe that Sennacherib went up against Jerusalem in his fourth campaign. The Assyrian scribes, knowing that the world was aware of Sennacherib's embarrassing defeat, have cleverly promoted the campaign to be his fourth, placing it between his various campaigns against Babylonia. We know, for example, of a minor expedition in the accession year of Ashurbanipal's reign against Khirbit on the Elamite frontier by one of the Assyrian governors. In a later text, this became the king's fourth campaign, with 2 campaigns against Egypt and Tyre preceding it. The Assyrian scribes were therefore not above falsifying the information, and it can be shown that a lot of the Assyrian and Babylonian records are deliberate attempts at deception. Bear in mind that these annals, which are recorded on prisms, had to have been made posthumously. Sennacherib died before he could record the details of his final campaign, so this must have been done at a later date. Whilst the scribes could not afford to completely ignore monumental texts in their inscriptions, they could not resist tampering with them either. The scribes could not even get the details right. They record Sennacherib as conquering Ashkelon, whereas the Bible, as well as the inscriptions at Khorsabad, tell us that this city should have been Lachish. This is not the only error which the scribes have made. Yet archaeologists are quick to dismiss the Bible in favour of these contrived chronicles and king lists. By doing so, despite the Bible's imperfections, they are rejecting our only true reliable source of history. We currently have 3 prisms recording the campaigns of Sennacherib: the Taylor Prism, Jerusalem Prism, and Oriental Prism. These prisms recording the Assyrian king's conquests are less than 15 inches, that is 38 centimetres high, and are hardly the sort of material a vainglorious egotistical king of Assyria would choose to record his annals. The description of the conquest of Ashkelon seems to echo the conquest of that city by Nebuchadnezzar too. The king of Tyre is named as Ethbaal in Sennacherib's annals. According to Josephus, Ethbaal was king of Tyre during the time of Nebuchadnezzar too. Sidkar, who is called king of Ashkelon by Sennacherib, is a variant spelling of the Hebrew name Sidkiah, who was king of Judah during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. All of this smacks of late invention by the Assyrian and Babylonian scribes. The lands which Sennacherib says were ruled by Sidkar should have belonged at that time to Jerusalem. The suggestion that they were ruled by a king of Ashkelon, even by someone with a Jewish name, seems unlikely. Basically, the cylinders on which Sennacherib's annals are recorded are all forgeries. The Rassam cylinder, which has been the cause of much confusion and controversy, is also fraudulent. It can be shown that this cylinder, which purportedly records the campaigns of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, dates no earlier than the time of Artaxerxes II, king of Persia. An Egyptian document, known as the Contest for the Breastplate of Inaros, which mentions many of the Egyptian kings referred to by Ashurbanipal, supposedly confuses the two periods of history, though the said Egyptian document is currently being dated even earlier than the time of Ashurbanipal. With the corrections I have made to the Egyptian chronology, however, this Egyptian document more correctly describes the situation in Egypt during the time of the Persian conquest. This is how corrupt our understanding of the Assyrian and Egyptian histories actually is. Note also that the Rassam cylinder does not even present the king's campaigns in the correct chronological order. The Limu or eponymy lists comprise a list of people who obtained the privileged position of chief magistrate or eponym in Assyria for a period of 1 year of a king's reign. As Professor James B. Pritchard records, the first full year of the reign of a king is always named after himself. The following years have originally been named after that official who won when lots were thrown to determine the eponym. Having demonstrated the extent of co-regency which occurred, and having demonstrated that Tiglath-Pileser III was king of Babylon from the beginning of his reign rather than from his 15th year, we have shown that these lists are as highly contrived as the king lists in which we have placed so much trust. In other words, they are as good as worthless as a basis for any firm chronology. And yet archaeologists swear by these lists. It is worth noting the problems with these Limu lists which have already come to light. J. E. Reid, for example, has noticed that, during the time of Ashurbanipal, the basic problem is that there are too many eponyms recorded. There is also a problem with the eponyms during the time of Nabu-Nasir. Emile Forres suggested that Balatu, variant Balassu, was originally intended to be eponym in 786, but was replaced by Nabu-Shara-Usur. Alternatively, Balatu could have been substituted as second eponym rather than first, but if so, his name is misplaced on the list. If these sorts of problems are found in the Bible, archaeologists will tear it to shreds. But because they occur in the Assyrian records, it is perfectly acceptable to gloss over these glaring inconsistencies. Basically, we have put our trust in a lot of lies and deceptions. At best, the ancient chroniclers were none the wiser than we are today. The evidence suggests, however, that they were deliberately trying to deceive us. When we realise what has happened, the Assyrian chronology can be reduced by 1,000 years, which is no insignificant reduction. The Egyptian chronology is even worse. Coming up in Part 2, In case you hadn't noticed, there are a lot of errors in the Bible. I shall go through some of those errors and explain why they have occurred and demonstrate how we need to adjust our thinking accordingly. That there are errors in the Bible is an indisputable fact, and anyone who denies it is simply burying their head in the sand. It is therefore essential that we understand what those errors are and why they have occurred. You might be shocked to learn just how many errors there actually are. Some might find it disconcerting, but we cannot deny that these errors exist. You should not, however, be put off by this, as the Bible is still our most reliable source of early history, but it has undergone two major conflagrations which have resulted in the text being badly damaged. I shall also provide an example of how accurate the Bible can be, by looking at the Chaldean period and demonstrating how Nebuchadnezzar, after recovering from his 7 years of madness, when the throne was restored to him, gave himself a new name. So stay with me for more enlightenment.